Moving on, we are now going to, still on home ground, we are going to be listening to the results of existing sectoral studies of the South African minimum wage experience to date. And Ben is going to share with us those results. And very briefly, Ben is a researcher at the Development Policy Research Unit at the University of Cape Town. He has written on the impact and enforcement of minimum wages in South Africa. Ben holds a master's degree in applied economics from University of Cape Town. He also holds a master's degree in economic and social history from the University of Oxford. His research interests include, I would say among others, labor economics, economic and social history. And as I say, he's going to share with us the results of existing sectoral studies of the South African minimum wage experience that we have seen so far. Let's welcome him with a round of applause, and thank you very much, Ben.
Okay, so let me get started. I'll try and be quite brief, and of course, I'm sort of plowing some of the same ground as the previous presenters. So what I will try to do is talk very briefly about minimum wages globally, insofar as that's relevant to the South African case. And then the main part of the presentation will focus on the South African minimum wage structure, and then some of the evidence that we have on minimum wage impacts for particular sectors. Okay, so we know that minimum wages are very common, and we've heard that there are a variety of systems that you can have, a sort of single national minimum wage, a regional approach, or some sort of combination between the two. And globally, there's a kind of even split between having a single national minimum wage and some kind of more complex schedule. These wage systems are usually overseen by some government body or a tripartite forum or an independent organization. And generally they have a few stated aims. This could be to prevent low pay and exploitation of labor. It could be to reduce inequality or poverty, to encourage labor productivity, and often, at least in the legislation, it's a combination of several of these. What we've also seen in maybe the last 2 decades is minimum wage policies become more popular in several low and middle income countries. So there are a few listed there, and South Africa is among them. Here's a brief table which shows you the split between countries that have a national minimum wage and a sectoral or a regional approach to setting wages. So you can see in Africa it's more popular to have a sectoral or regional approach, whereas in Europe and former Soviet states it's a national approach that is more popular. Okay, so the employment debate, which we've heard a lot about, here are just 2 quotes to exemplify the different opinions. So this is a kind of mid-90s discussion about the impact of minimum wages on employment after the Card-and-Kruger studies, which suggested that there could be positive impacts of minimum wages on employment. So you have James Buchanan, who was a Nobel laureate, who suggests it's impossible to have a positive impact on employment, and then David Card, talking a while later, saying that if you raise the minimum wage a little, not by a huge amount, but by a little, you won't necessarily cause a big employment reduction. In some cases, you could get an employment increase. And so this kind of theoretical discussion then produced a huge range of research. And probably in the 2000s, you would see the work of Newmark and Washer, who've done a big meta-study of most of the literature, presenting a case which suggests kind of small negative impacts overall, versus a Card-and-Kruger, who would maybe be less willing to agree with the negative impact side of the story. But again, as Alan mentioned earlier, this is largely a high-income country affair, so If we look at evidence for low and middle income countries while growing, this is a kind of limited literature, partly because there are a lot of data restrictions and doing minimum wage impact work requires you to have quite good access to data over time. And in Africa, as far as I know, there are only 4 countries for which we have evidence on minimum wage impacts. The most popular country is South Africa, where we have several studies that have taken place after sectoral determinations were introduced in the late 90s and early 2000s. Okay. So the international evidence, as we've heard, suggests that in general you get no or very little employment response to increases in a minimum wage. So I won't dwell on that. And then here are the graphs which were mentioned in the previous talk. So this is focusing on high income countries, and this is again a graph of wage employment elasticities, so only statistically significant elasticities. And you can see there's a range that goes from positive to negative, but on average, so I report the median and the mean there, the elasticity is relatively small and negative and close to 0. There are fewer studies on low and middle income countries, and as was mentioned before as well, that often this would be a country that has several studies within the economy and even within a sector on, say, youth or women versus men and so on. But the story is much the same as the high-income country evidence, where you see kind of small negative impacts on average. So to kind of summarize that debate, it's maybe useful to look at a graph like this, which has employment levels on the y-axis and the level of a minimum wage increase on the x-axis, where you could imagine that you can increase the minimum wage up to a point before you start seeing any negative impacts, and maybe there should be a sort of small positive line somewhere where it's flat. And the blue line might be a particular sector which is more robust to minimum wage increases, so maybe a non-tradable sector or a sector that has a labor share of overall cost which is relatively low, whereas the green line might represent a sector that's more sensitive to minimum wage increases, where if you increase the minimum wage beyond a certain level, then you will start to see declines in employment. And as Alan said, probably we don't really know where this point of no return or point of decline is. Okay, so minimum wages in South Africa, as many of you will know, we have a kind of sectoral system which has minimum wages for different occupations and different geographic regions. So on one hand, we have a collective bargaining system, and our estimate is that that covers about 20% of workers who earn below the Basic Conditions of Employment Act's income cutoff, which I think is around 99 Rand an hour. So if you take all the workers below that, about 20% of them are covered by some sort of collective bargaining system, and there are about 45% of workers who are covered by a sectoral determination. This leaves, in addition to private unions, about 20% of workers who remain uncovered by any kind of legislation or formal bargaining process. So here's just a snapshot of the sectoral determinations. The only point here is to show that they're relatively complex. So you have a set of sectors that are covered. Within those sectors, you have occupations that have different wage rates. And then across those occupations, you have geographic areas, so urban, rural, and semi-urban, where there are also different wage rates. So if you compare South Africa to some other countries, you can see that South Africa has one of the most complex minimum wage systems, and that's not including collective bargaining, which would push you into kind of thousands of different point estimates for wage rates. Okay. Another important feature of the sectoral determination system is that there are big differences in levels. So you can see this is just a graph showing the lowest and the highest set minimum wage rate in each sector against the highest one, which is for a manager in the wholesale and retail sector. So that's at the top at the right. So that's 1. And then you can see where the other rates kind of match up to that. And it's clear that there's kind of a huge variation where you have at the top end a minimum wage of 6,500 Rand per month, which is at 190% of South Africa's median wage. And then you have the lowest sectoral determination for rural domestic workers, which is at 50% of the median wage. Then here's just a graph showing how minimum wages have grown over time. So it starts in 2007 there, just because that's the time when we had information on all sectoral determinations. And the top one is the nominal rate, and the bottom is the real rate. And the real rate is, over those several years, an increase of around 35% over time. Okay. So the South African work looking at minimum wage impacts is quite detailed, so it's not just looking at a trend over time and tracking employment versus wage changes. It's trying to really get into the data and see what would have happened to this group of workers if they hadn't had a minimum wage introduced. So the data that's usually used is the Labour Force Survey, which ran biannually from 2000 to the year 2007. So that's a national household survey, covers about 30,000 households, and has relatively detailed labour market information. And so usually all these years are pulled together, and then you can combine it to look at the period when the sectoral determinations were introduced in a particular sector and try and track the impact. So I'll go through this very briefly. Basically, we use two methods. So I've done some work on this with Haroon and others, and then there's been other work by researchers in different universities. But essentially, you try to use what's called a difference in differences approach, where you compare a treatment versus a kind of comparison group to see what would have happened to a similar group of workers if they hadn't had a minimum wage introduced. So you could think of in 2003, a minimum wage is introduced for domestic workers. You use the household surveys to try and create a group of workers who look similar to domestic workers in individual characteristics but don't have a minimum wage applied to them. And then you compare the outcomes of those two groups over time. So that's what we do there. It has some problems. It's not perfect. So we try to augment that with a different strategy, which relies on geographic differences in wage levels in the pre-minimum wage periods for each sector. So this is slightly more complicated, but it is essentially another version of the graph that Alan presented with the lines comparing how far away you were from the minimum wage before it was introduced, expecting that people who are further below, that their wages would rise much faster towards that minimum. So I'll just quickly present the main findings of this research. So looking at domestic workers, there have been 3 papers. So Tom Hertz in the mid-2000s, and he finds no disemployment effects after the introduction of a sectoral determination for domestic workers. It should be said that this is not exactly the same as an increase in the minimum wage. This is an introduction of a minimum wage. So there might be some slightly different effects there, but nonetheless, then Taran Dinkelman and Vimal Ranchad did a similar study, probably more technical, as well as Haroon and others, and they also find no disemployment effects for domestic workers. Then Haroon worked on a paper that looks at not only domestic workers, but several other sectors, and so retail, private security, forestry, and the taxi industry, where again they find no disemployment effects, but a small reduction in the number of hours worked on average. Then the work in agriculture, which maybe some of you will be aware of, suggests that there were negative employment effects in agriculture after the minimum wage was introduced in 2003. And then there is some preliminary work on the increase in 2013, which suggests that there may have been kind of gendered impacts of the 50% increase, where women were laid off more than men in agriculture. And then finally, there's been work by Nicoline Atras and Jeremy Seekings on the clothing and textile industry, which suggests that there were jobs threatened by minimum wage increased enforcement of minimum wages in the clothing and textiles bargaining councils. So that's a slightly different approach. It doesn't use the same kind of econometric approach, but that's the evidence from there. So I think, I mean, in general, that's that's what we know so far, and it's helpful in thinking about the potential impacts of a national minimum wage. It obviously doesn't tell us everything. It suggests that there are sectoral differences which one should be aware of, and which is one, I guess, plus of having a sectoral system, is that you can take account of differences across sectors. But I'll stop there, and then we can have more time for questions. Thank you.